My IOP connected the novels Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer and Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Specifically, I connected the characters Okonkwo with Christopher McCandless. My argument was that both Chris McCandless of Into the Wild and Okonkwo of Things Fall Apart experience exile and ultimately loneliness. One is self-inflicted, while the other is inflicted by society. Before I get into the text, I'll talk a little bit about exile. Exile is defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as a state or a period of forced absence from one's country or home, or the state or a period of voluntary absence from one's country or home. So this leaves a little bit of room for voluntary or forced, and I'll show the two different types in my presentation. First, I'll give a little context on exile, and I'll share a poem called Exiled by Edna St. Vincent Millay. This part of the poem that I chose shows clearly the feelings associated with exile. I'll read it. Searching my heart for its true sorrow, this is the thing I find to be, that I am weary of words and people, sick of the city, wanting the sea, wanting the sticky, salty sweetness of the strong wind and shattered spray, wanting the loud sound and the soft sound of the big surf that breaks all day. I chose this part of the poem in particular because I believe it relates to the feelings of Chris McCandless. For him, the sea in this poem would be like Alaska, because he wants to be submerged in the Alaskan wilderness away from people and civilization. In this poem, the speaker wants to be away from the city and wants the sea. So it's like Chris, but he just wants Alaska instead of the sea. This brings me to Chris's type of exile. Chris chose to exile himself, to get away from the rest of the world by escaping to Alaska. And he was friendly and successful, but I don't think he was meant to be mainstream, which is one of the reasons why he chose to exile himself. And Chris was friendly and well-liked, but was often disgusted by humans and with what the world has come to. He also sought more alone time than the average person, and by doing so, he alienated himself. This alienation progressed as Chris grew older, and I'll just read some quotes to back that up. Chris was a high achiever in almost everything that caught his fancy. Academically, he brought home A's with little effort. That was on page 109. And on page 110, it said, both Chris and Corinne shared waltz musical aptitude. Chris took up the guitar, piano, French horn. On page 112, it said, Chris was the captain of the cross-country squad. And on page 110, it said, Chris inherited Billy's angelic features, most notably her eyes, the black depths of which betrayed his every emotion. Although he was small, in school photographs he's always in the front row, the shortest kid in class, Chris was strong for his size and well coordinated. Those back up that he was very friendly and successful and popular, and he could have had a very mainstream life and could have had a career, but chose not to. I also had the quote that said, we like companionship, see, but we can't stand to be around people for very long. So we go out, get ourselves lost, come back for a while, and then get the hell out again. I think this explains Chris very well, because he does like people and he does like company, but he can't stand people for very long. So he takes them in small doses and then has a lot of alone time. On to my second point was that Chris was misunderstood by his parents. This rift between Chris and his parents caused him to drift a lot, and it showed more and more over time. This relationship sparked angry feelings and questions within Chris, many of which concerned human nature and the purpose of life. Some quotes to back that up include, early in his senior year at Woodson High School, Chris informed his parents that he had no intention of going to college. That was on page 114. And then when Walt and Billy suggested that he needed a college degree to attain a fulfilling career, Chris answered that careers were demanding 20th century inventions, more of a liability than an asset, and that he would do fine without one, thank you. And that was on page 114. On page 116, it said, as soon as high school was over, Chris declared he was going to get behind the wheel of his new car and spend the summer driving across the country. On page 124, it said, during his senior year at Emory, Chris lived off campus in his bare, Spartan room furnished with milk crates and a mattress on the floor. Few of his friends ever saw him outside of classes. And at this point, he's starting to drift more and more, and it grows from high school to college. And he doesn't only drift in the relationship between him and his parents, he also drifts from his friends and starts, his mind keeps drifting, and he thinks more deeply into life and, issues. Another quote is that Chris seldom contacted his parents that year, senior year of college, and because he had no phone, they couldn't easily contact him. Walt and Billy grew increasingly worried about their son's emotional distance. That was page 124. And this is where he's getting pretty close to leaving. So, I also had the quote that it was a big issue between Chris and his parents because Chris didn't really like flaunting his wealth or being wealthy at all, whereas his parents grew up in poverty and grew to be wealthy and successful in their careers. And it said, they bought nice clothes, some jewelry for Billy, a Cadillac. Eventually, they purchased the townhouse on the bay and the sailboat. They took the kids to Europe, skiing in Breckenridge on a Caribbean cruise. And Chris, Billy acknowledges, was embarrassed by all that. Her son, the teenage Tolstoyan, believed that wealth was shameful, corrupting, inherently evil. This was probably the biggest issue between Chris and his parents, and it just shows how a lot of their ideals in life were very different. Also, it shows that this is another reason why Chris chose exile. A character very different from Chris, who all he wanted was to be mainstream, and he wanted to fit in, and he wanted to do well in his life and be successful, was Okonkwo from Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. And Okonkwo was very similar to Chris McCandless's parents because they both were born into poverty or like a lower family, lower class, and they wanted to rise out of it. So that's why Chris's parents had the drive to do that, and that's why Okonkwo had such a drive to thrive in his society. And Okonkwo didn't want to be exiled. He committed a crime and was forced to leave Umuofia by his fellow clansmen. And he was forced to leave because he accidentally killed someone. This happened when, at the funeral of a respected elder, Okonkwo and other clansmen shot their guns in honor. However, when Okonkwo shot his gun, it exploded, and a piece of metal hit the elder's 16-year-old son, whose heart was pierced. He died on the spot. Even though it was an accident, the shot had been fired by Okonkwo. To kill a clansman, whether by accident or not, was committing an act against Ani. Ani is the Igbo earth deity. Accidental killings are considered a female crime, and as a punishment, Okonkwo was exiled from Umuofia for 7 years. Exile for Okonkwo was one of the worst things that could have happened because it's exactly the opposite of what he wanted. He just wanted to fit in and be successful, but he couldn't because he was exiled. And Ani was not only the Igbo earth goddess, but she was considered like their Mother Earth, and she was one of the most important gods of the Igbo people. She was also the spirit of fertility, and she had her own priestess in human form that officiated during religious ceremonies dedicated to her. She also presided in matters involving crime against her, which included incest, birth, twins, death, and burial. So to wrap things up, although their exiles were quite different, Okonkwo's due to a crime and Chris's due to his own interests, Okonkwo's enforced by the village and Chris's self-imposed, both characters experience loneliness, and in the end, both Okonkwo and Chris end up alone and dead by their own doing. I say this because Chris died of starvation associated with his consumption of a poisonous plant. Although he wanted to get out of the wilderness, he didn't make it out because he was underprepared and didn't know the difference between a poisonous plant and a regular plant. And Okonkwo hung himself because he knew that if he didn't, he would have been killed as a repercussion of his intentional murder. So my big so what is that exile has many different circumstances and one final result, loneliness. Thank you.